The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. The heavy black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, its weight a constant reminder of the honor and responsibility that came with being one of the Queen's Guard. At 28 years old, James had served in this prestigious position for 3 years, and, in all that time, he had never once broken protocol. Not even close. The rules were simple, carved in stone by centuries of tradition. Stand perfectly still. Eyes forward. No talking. No smiling. No reaction to anything happening around you, no matter how unusual or tempting it might be to respond. Tourists could take pictures, make jokes, try to make you laugh, even touch you sometimes, but a Queen's Guard remained motionless as a statue. It was more than a job. It was a sacred duty that connected him to hundreds of years of British military tradition. James took his position at the entrance to the castle, his polished black boots clicking sharply against the stone. The familiar weight of his rifle rested against his shoulder, and he could feel the crisp autumn air against his face. This was his favorite time of year to be on guard duty. The summer crowds had thinned out, but there were still enough visitors to make the day interesting. He had learned to appreciate the small things during his long hours of standing still, the changing light, the sounds of the city beyond the castle walls, the conversations he could overhear without appearing to listen. As the castle gates opened to the public, the first wave of tourists began to trickle in. James had seen it all before, the excited children pointing at his uniform, the teenagers daring each other to try to make him move, the elderly couples taking careful photographs. He had developed a kind of meditation during these hours, a way of being completely present while appearing completely absent. His fellow guards often said he had a natural talent for it. The morning passed quietly. A group of Japanese tourists spent 20 minutes taking turns posing next to him, their camera flashes creating brief bursts of light in his peripheral vision. A young man from America tried the classic routine of telling jokes, hoping to crack James's stoic expression. 2 teenage girls giggled as they debated whether the guards were real people or just very realistic statues. James had heard that debate countless times before. Around 11 o'clock, something different caught his attention. Through the corner of his eye, he noticed a small family approaching. There was a mother, probably in her early 30s, pushing a wheelchair. In the wheelchair sat a boy who looked to be about 7 years old. The child was thin, almost fragile-looking, wearing a knit cap that couldn't quite hide the fact that he had very little hair underneath. Even without looking directly, James could sense something special about this family. The mother was speaking softly to her son as they got closer. "Look, Tommy, there's one of the Queen's Guard. Just like in the pictures we looked at online." Her voice carried a mixture of excitement and something else, perhaps hope, or maybe the kind of forced cheerfulness that parents sometimes use when they're trying to be strong for their children. Tommy's eyes were wide with wonder as he stared up at James. Unlike most children who visited the castle, Tommy wasn't giggling or trying to get a reaction. He was simply amazed, as if he was seeing something magical. The boy whispered something to his mother, and she leaned down to listen. "He wants to know if you're really real," the mother said, looking up at James with a gentle smile. "He's been so excited about this trip. We've been planning it for months." James, of course, said nothing and showed no reaction. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for. Maintain position. Stay focused. Don't break character, no matter how touching or unusual the circumstances might be. He had seen sick children before, families making special trips to create memories. It was always heartbreaking, but his duty was clear. But there was something about Tommy that was different. Maybe it was the way the little boy was studying James's uniform with such careful attention, as if he was trying to memorize every detail. Or perhaps it was the quiet courage in his eyes, the way he wasn't asking for pity or special treatment, just genuinely fascinated by what he was seeing. Tommy began pointing out different parts of James's uniform to his mother, whispering observations about the bright red fabric, the shiny buttons, the impressive height of the bearskin hat. "Mummy, his buttons are so shiny," Tommy said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he polishes them every day?" "I imagine he takes very good care of his uniform," his mother replied. "It's a very important job he has." James could hear the conversation clearly, and, despite his training, he found himself genuinely touched by the boy's innocent curiosity. Tommy wasn't trying to be disruptive or get attention like so many visitors. He was simply a child who was genuinely interested in learning about something new. The respect in his voice when he talked about James's job was something even many adults didn't show. More tourists began to gather around, some taking pictures of the touching scene of the sick child admiring the guard. James noticed a few people whispering among themselves, and he could catch fragments of their conversations. Someone mentioned how brave the little boy was. Another person wondered aloud about his condition. A woman with a kind face approached Tommy's mother and struck up a quiet conversation. Through these overheard conversations, James began to piece together more of Tommy's story. The family had traveled from Scotland specifically for this visit to Windsor Castle. Tommy had been receiving treatment at a hospital in London, and this trip was a special treat, something the family had been planning as a bright spot during a difficult time. His mother had promised him they would see the famous Queen's Guard, and Tommy had been counting down the days. "This is even better than I imagined," Tommy said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "He looks so strong and brave. Do you think he ever gets scared?" "Even the bravest people get scared sometimes," his mother answered carefully. "But what makes them brave is that they do their job anyway, even when it's hard." James felt something stir inside him as he listened to this exchange. Here was a 7-year-old boy who was facing something that would terrify most adults, and yet he was talking about bravery in relation to someone else. The irony wasn't lost on James. Tommy was showing more courage than most people would ever have to summon in their entire lives, and he was using it to express admiration for someone else's strength. The crowd around them continued to grow. Word seemed to be spreading somehow that there was something special happening here. James noticed several people with their phones out, not just taking the usual tourist photos, but seeming to document what they were witnessing. A few visitors had tears in their eyes as they watched Tommy's innocent fascination with the pageantry and tradition of the Queen's Guard. Tommy's mother checked her watch and whispered something to her son. James could see the disappointment cross the boy's face, even though Tommy tried to hide it. They had other places to be, other parts of their London visit to complete while they had the chance. The reality of their situation meant that every moment was precious, every experience had to be carefully planned and timed. "We should probably head to the other parts of the castle now," Tommy's mother said gently. "We want to see everything we can while we're here." "Just a few more minutes?" Tommy asked hopefully. "Please? I want to remember everything about him." James felt his heart clench. In his 3 years of guard duty, he had never felt such a strong urge to break protocol. Every instinct in his body was telling him to acknowledge this brave little boy, to give him something special to remember. But his training was equally strong. The uniform he wore represented something bigger than himself. The tradition he upheld had meaning precisely because it was maintained without exception. The internal struggle was unlike anything James had experienced before. He thought about his own childhood, about the times adults had gone out of their way to make him feel special or important. He thought about what this moment might mean to Tommy, what it might mean to his family. He also thought about his duty, his commitment to the crown, and the trust that had been placed in him. As Tommy's mother began to wheel him away, the little boy turned back for one last look. "Goodbye, Mr. Guard," he said softly. "Thank you for being so impressive." It was at that moment that James made a decision that would change everything. For the first time in his career as a Queen's Guard, for the first time in centuries of unbroken tradition, he felt that duty and compassion were pulling him in the same direction rather than opposite directions. Sometimes, he realized, the most important rules are the unwritten ones, the ones that remind us why traditions exist in the first place. The crowd had grown larger now, with dozens of people watching the scene unfold. Many had their cameras ready, sensing that they might be about to witness something extraordinary. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, though Tommy and his mother seemed unaware of the attention they had attracted. They were focused only on each other and on making the most of their special day together. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his uniform, the weight of tradition, and the weight of this moment all settling on his shoulders. In a few seconds, he would have to make a choice that would either honor the letter of his duty or the spirit of it. Either way, he knew that this morning at Windsor Castle would be remembered for a very long time. James Morrison had faced many challenges during his military career, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. As he watched Tommy's mother begin to wheel the brave little boy away from his post, every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong. Here was a child who had shown more grace and courage than most adults ever would, and James was about to let him leave with nothing more than a memory of a silent, motionless figure in a red coat. The decision came to him suddenly, like a bolt of lightning cutting through a storm. Without breaking his rigid posture, James did something that no Queen's Guard had done in living memory. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head toward Tommy. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a clear acknowledgement of the little boy's presence. Then, in a gesture that would be captured by dozens of cameras and phones, James gave Tommy the smallest, most gentle nod of recognition. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Tommy's eyes widened in amazement, and his face broke into the brightest smile James had ever seen. The crowd around them erupted in surprised gasps and delighted murmurs. Several people began clapping spontaneously, while others fumbled for their cameras to capture what they had just witnessed. But James wasn't finished yet. Moving with the same measured precision he used in all his military duties, James took one step forward from his post. Then, another. The crowd fell silent, hardly believing what they were seeing. A Queen's Guard was breaking the most fundamental rule of his position. He was abandoning his post to approach a visitor. Tommy's mother looked up at James with tears in her eyes, unsure of what was happening but recognizing that it was something extraordinary. She had seen the Queen's Guard many times in pictures and, on television, always perfectly still, always maintaining their stoic composure. She knew enough about British military tradition to understand that what was happening right now was unprecedented. James walked the few steps to where Tommy sat in his wheelchair, then did something that made the entire crowd hold its breath. He slowly, carefully, lowered himself into a perfect military squat so that he was at eye level with the 7-year-old boy. The massive bearskin hat made the gesture even more striking, this imposing figure making himself small enough to look directly into a child's eyes. "Hello, Tommy," James said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I hear you've been very brave." Tommy's face was a picture of pure wonder. He looked back and forth between James and his mother, as if he needed confirmation that this was really happening. You can talk," he whispered. "I can," James replied with a small smile. "But I usually don't. This is a very special exception, for a very special boy." The crowd pressed closer, but respectfully, understanding that they were witnessing something remarkable. Phones were recording from every angle, but the atmosphere was reverent rather than intrusive. Even the tourists who didn't speak English seemed to understand that something meaningful was taking place. Tommy's mother covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the kindness of this gesture. She had spent so many months being strong for her son, maintaining hope and positivity during the most difficult period of their lives. To see a complete stranger show such compassion to Tommy was almost more than she could bear. "Are you really one of the Queen's Guards?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with awe. "I am," James confirmed. "My job is to protect the royal family and keep them safe. It's a very important job, and it requires following a lot of rules. But sometimes, the most important rule is to be kind to people who deserve kindness." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if he understood the weight of what James was saying. "My mummy says I have to be brave when I go to the hospital." "Is that like following rules too?" James felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was a child who was facing unimaginable challenges, and he was drawing parallels between his own courage and the discipline of a soldier. "Yes," James said softly. "Being brave when you're scared is one of the hardest rules to follow. And, from what I can see, you're very good at it." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with James answering Tommy's questions about his uniform, his duties, and life as a Queen's Guard. He explained how the bearskin hat was made, why his uniform was red, and what it felt like to stand guard at the castle. Tommy listened to every word with rapt attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed remarkable maturity for his age.
Do you ever wish you could move around when you're standing guard? Tommy asked.
Sometimes, James admitted.
But, knowing that I'm doing something important makes it easier.
Just like how you're brave at the hospital because you know it's helping you get better. Several people in the crowd were openly crying now, moved by the gentle wisdom James was sharing with this remarkable child. The scene had attracted the attention of other guards and castle staff, but, rather than intervening, they seemed to understand that something special was happening that transcended normal protocol. After about 10 minutes, James knew he needed to address the reality of what he had done. He had abandoned his post, broken centuries of tradition, and violated direct orders. There would be consequences, and he was prepared to face them. But, first, he wanted to make sure Tommy had something special to remember from this encounter. Standing up slowly, James removed one of the polished brass buttons from his red tunic. It was a small thing, but it was genuine military issue, part of his official uniform. He held it out to Tommy with ceremony befitting a medal presentation.
"This is for you," James said formally. "A token of recognition for your extraordinary courage.
Not many people receive honors from the Queen's Guard, but you've earned this one." Tommy's eyes grew wide as he accepted the button with trembling hands. He held it up to the light, watching how it gleamed in the autumn sun.
"Is it really from your uniform?" he asked in amazement.
"It is," James confirmed. "And now it's yours to keep forever." Tommy's mother was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the kindness of this gesture.
"Thank you," she whispered to James.
"You have no idea what this means to him, to us."
"Actually, I think I do," James replied quietly. "Sometimes we need reminders of what really matters. Tommy reminded me of that today." The crowd began to applaud, a sustained and heartfelt recognition of what they had witnessed. James stood and took a step back, but he wasn't finished yet.
In one final gesture that would become the most memorable part of the entire encounter, he raised his right hand in a crisp military salute directed specifically at Tommy. "It has been an honor to meet you, sir," James said with complete sincerity. Tommy, without any prompting from his mother, raised his small hand in response, attempting to mirror James's salute. The image of the magnificent Queen's Guard in his full regalia saluting a frail 7-year-old boy in a wheelchair, who was bravely saluting back, was captured by dozens of cameras and would soon travel around the world. As James finally returned to his post, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy around the castle entrance had completely changed. People were talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, sharing photos and videos, calling friends and family to describe the incredible scene they had just observed. Tommy and his mother stayed for a few more minutes, with Tommy clutching his brass button and stealing glances at James, who had resumed his traditional position but somehow seemed more human now, more connected to the world around him. Finally, they too moved on to continue their visit to the castle, but not before Tommy waved one last goodbye to his new friend. As word of the incident began to spread beyond the immediate crowd, James knew that his actions would soon come to the attention of his commanding officers. The Queen's Guard operated under strict discipline, and what he had done was a clear violation of protocol. He had left his post, interacted with the public, and removed part of his uniform. By any measure of military discipline, he had failed in his duty. But, as James stood at attention, feeling the familiar weight of his rifle and the autumn breeze on his face, he felt no regret. For the first time in his 3 years of service, he felt that he had truly honored the spirit of what it meant to be a protector. The rules existed for important reasons, but the reasons behind the rules were even more important. The brass button was a small loss compared to what Tommy had given him in return. The little boy had reminded James why traditions matter, not as empty rituals, but as expressions of the values that make civilization possible. Courage, honor, service, and compassion weren't just military virtues, they were human ones. As the day continued, James noticed that other visitors approached his post differently. Word of what had happened was spreading through the castle, and people looked at him not just as a ceremonial figure, but as a human being who had shown remarkable kindness. Several people thanked him quietly as they passed, and more than one parent pointed him out to their children as an example of what it means to do the right thing. The incident would eventually reach the ears of his superiors, the media, and even members of the royal family themselves. But, for now, in these quiet moments after the crowd had moved on, James simply stood at his post and reflected on a morning that had changed everything. He had broken protocol for the first time in his career, and he had never felt more proud to wear the uniform of the Queen's Guard. Within hours of the encounter, the videos and photos from that morning at Windsor Castle were spreading across social media like wildfire. What had started as a private moment between a soldier and a sick child had become something much larger, a story that seemed to capture everything people needed to hear about kindness, duty, and doing the right thing even when it's difficult. The first video to go viral was posted by Sarah Chen, a tourist from Canada who had been visiting the castle with her teenage daughter. She had captured the entire encounter on her phone, from the moment James first acknowledged Tommy with that subtle nod, through the conversation, the presentation of the brass button, and that final, powerful salute. Her caption was simple: "Sometimes breaking the rules is the right thing to do. This Queen's Guard just restored my faith in humanity." Within 6 hours, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. Within 12 hours, it had been shared by major news outlets around the world. The story seemed to resonate with people from every background and culture. The image of the imposing guard kneeling down to speak with the brave little boy transcended language barriers and touched something universal about human compassion. James Morrison knew none of this as he completed his shift that afternoon. He had maintained his post for the remainder of the day, standing with the same discipline and precision he had always shown. But everything felt different now. Visitors approached with a different energy, often smiling at him with genuine warmth rather than just curiosity. Several people had quietly thanked him as they passed, though he maintained his traditional silence and composure. It wasn't until he returned to the barracks that evening that James began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. His fellow guards were gathered around someone's phone, watching something intently. The room fell silent when James walked in, and all eyes turned to him. "Mate," said Corporal Davies, holding up his phone, "you need to see this." James watched in amazement as he saw himself on the small screen, kneeling beside Tommy's wheelchair, presenting the brass button, offering that salute. The video quality was remarkably clear, and James was struck by how the encounter looked from the outside. He had been so focused on Tommy in the moment that he hadn't fully appreciated the visual impact of what was happening, the contrast between his imposing uniform and gentle demeanor, the way the crowd had respectfully gathered around them, the pure joy on Tommy's face. "How many people have seen this?" James asked quietly. "Millions," Davies replied. "It's everywhere, James. BBC, CNN, social media, everywhere. You're famous, mate." But James wasn't thinking about fame. He was thinking about the conversation he would inevitably have with his commanding officer. Breaking protocol wasn't a minor infraction, it was the kind of mistake that could end a career. The Queen's Guard operated on tradition and discipline that went back centuries. What he had done, no matter how well-intentioned, was a serious breach of his duties. The call came at 8 o'clock that evening. "Sergeant Morrison, report to Colonel Harrison's office immediately." James put on his dress uniform and made the walk across the base to the administrative building. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had known this moment would come, and he had accepted it as the price of doing what he felt was right. But that didn't make it any less daunting. Colonel Harrison was a career military man in his 50s, someone who had served with distinction in multiple conflicts and had little patience for breaches of protocol. James had always respected him, even feared him a little. Harrison represented everything that was serious and unforgiving about military discipline. "Sit down, Sergeant," Harrison said without looking up from a file on his desk. James could see his own service record spread out, along with what appeared to be printed copies of news articles and social media posts. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Harrison finally looked up. His expression was unreadable, the kind of poker face that came from years of making difficult decisions about other people's careers. "I suppose you know why you're here," Harrison said finally. "Yes, sir. I broke protocol. I left my post and interacted with a civilian in direct violation of standing orders." "You did more than that," Harrison continued. "You removed part of your uniform and gave it to a member of the public. You abandoned your position for nearly 15 minutes.
You drew unprecedented attention to yourself and, by extension, to the entire Queen's Guard. James sat perfectly still, accepting each criticism without trying to defend himself. Everything Harrison was saying was factually accurate. The reasons behind his actions didn't change the fact that he had violated fundamental rules of his position. However, Harrison continued, and James detected the slightest shift in his tone. I've also received some interesting communications today. Harrison pulled out a letter from his desk drawer, real paper, with an official letterhead that James recognized immediately. It was from Buckingham Palace. It seems that word of your actions this morning reached some very high places very quickly, Harrison said. Her Majesty was made aware of the incident within hours of it happening. Social media, it turns out, moves faster than official channels. James felt his heart pounding, but he maintained his composure. If he was going to be dismissed from service, at least it would be direct from the top. Harrison opened the letter and began to read. The Queen has been made aware of Sergeant Morrison's actions at Windsor Castle this morning. While she recognizes that protocol was breached, she wishes to express her personal gratitude for the compassion shown to a young visitor during his time of need. The Queen believes that the highest duty of those who serve the Crown is to embody the values of kindness and service that define the best of British character. James blinked, hardly believing what he was hearing. Harrison continued reading. Her Majesty requests that Sergeant Morrison's actions be viewed not as a breach of protocol, but as an exemplary demonstration of the human qualities that make military service meaningful. She further requests that no disciplinary action be taken, and that this incident be used as an example of how duty and compassion can work together rather than in opposition. Harrison set the letter down and looked directly at James. Congratulations, Sergeant. You've managed to break the rules and receive royal approval for it in the same day. That might be a first in the history of the British military. James was speechless. He had prepared himself for dismissal, demotion, or at minimum a severe reprimand. The idea that his actions would receive not just understanding but royal endorsement was beyond anything he could have imagined. That's not all, Harrison continued, pulling out another document. I've also received calls from the media, from military historians, from child advocacy groups, and from about a dozen different charities. It seems your young friend Tommy has quite a story, and your gesture has brought attention to some important causes. Harrison explained that Tommy was battling a rare form of childhood leukemia, and his family had been struggling not just with the medical challenges but with the financial burden of his treatment. The attention from James's gesture had led to donations pouring in from around the world, enough to ensure that Tommy would receive the best possible care without his family facing financial ruin. Sometimes, Harrison said, the most important military action happens when someone decides that human decency outranks military procedure. What you did today reminded a lot of people why we serve in the first place. James felt overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. His simple gesture of kindness had somehow resonated far beyond what he had intended, creating ripple effects that were helping Tommy and his family in ways he never could have anticipated. However, Harrison continued, returning to his more familiar stern tone, we can't have guards abandoning their posts whenever they feel moved to do so. What you did was right in this specific circumstance, but it can't become a precedent. The discipline and tradition of the Queen's Guard exist for important reasons. I understand, sir, James replied. It won't happen again. Actually, Harrison said with the hint of a smile, I hope it will. Not the breaking protocol part, but the part where you remember that we're human beings first and soldiers second. The challenge is figuring out how to balance both. As James left the colonel's office, his head was spinning with everything that had happened. In the space of a single day, he had gone from a disciplined but anonymous guard to someone whose actions were being discussed around the world. But, more importantly, he had learned that sometimes the greatest service comes not from following orders blindly, but from understanding the deeper purpose behind those orders. The next morning, James returned to his post at Windsor Castle with a new understanding of his role. He would maintain the same discipline and precision that had always defined the Queen's Guard, but he would also carry with him the knowledge that compassion and duty could work together in ways he had never imagined. As he took his position at the castle entrance, James noticed something different. There were more visitors than usual,
and many of them were looking at him with recognition and respect. Word had spread that this was the guard who had shown such kindness to the sick little boy, and people seemed to approach the entire experience of visiting Windsor Castle with greater appreciation for the human beings behind the ceremonial uniforms. Around mid-morning, James noticed a familiar figure approaching. Tommy was back, this time with not just his mother but what appeared to be extended family members. The little boy was still in his wheelchair, but he seemed to have more energy than he had the day before, and he was wearing the brass button James had given him pinned proudly to his jacket. As Tommy's group approached, James felt that familiar internal struggle between protocol and compassion. But, this time, he had guidance from the highest possible authority. The Queen herself had indicated that sometimes the most important rule was to remember the human values behind military service. James remained at attention, but when Tommy waved at him with a bright smile, James allowed himself the smallest nod of acknowledgement, the same subtle gesture that had started everything the day before. Tommy's face lit up with joy, and he pointed excitedly to the button on his jacket, showing his family the treasure he had received from his friend, the Queen's Guard. It was a small moment, but James understood now that small moments could have enormous meaning. His simple gesture of kindness had reminded people around the world that rules and compassion didn't have to be enemies, that tradition and humanity could work together, and that sometimes the most important duty of all is simply being kind to someone who needs kindness. As the day continued, James stood at his post with a new sense of purpose. He was still a Queen's Guard, bound by centuries of tradition and military discipline. But he was also a reminder that behind every uniform, every rule, and every tradition, there were human beings trying to do the right thing in a complicated world. And, sometimes, doing the right thing meant remembering that the most important protocol of all was treating each other with dignity and compassion. 3 weeks after the encounter that had captured the world's attention, James Morrison's life had settled into a new kind of normal. He still reported for duty at Windsor Castle, still wore the same red uniform and bearskin hat, and still maintained the same disciplined posture that had defined the Queen's Guard for centuries. But everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The media attention had been intense but respectful. Unlike many viral stories that burned bright and faded quickly, the story of the guard who broke protocol for a sick child seemed to have genuine staying power. James had given only one interview, to the BBC, and had used the opportunity to redirect attention toward Tommy's courage and the work of children's charities. He wasn't comfortable being called a hero, but he was pleased that the attention had brought real help to families dealing with childhood illness. More importantly, James had begun to notice changes in how people interacted with the Queen's Guard overall. Visitors to the castle seemed more respectful, more aware that the men in the red uniforms were real people with their own stories and motivations. Children who had once tried to make the guards laugh or move now often approached with genuine curiosity about their service and dedication. The tourism experience had somehow become more meaningful for everyone involved. On this particular Wednesday morning, James was surprised to see a familiar black car pulling up to the castle's administrative entrance. He recognized it as one of the official vehicles used by senior members of the royal household. James maintained his position, but he couldn't help wondering if this unexpected visit had anything to do with his breach of protocol 3 weeks earlier. About 30 minutes later, James noticed movement near the castle's main visitor entrance. A small group of people was approaching, led by someone he immediately recognized despite having never met her in person. The Princess of Wales was walking toward his post, accompanied by what appeared to be a small entourage of staff and security personnel. James felt his heart rate increase, but his training took over. He had been drilled countless times on the proper protocol for interactions with members of the royal family. Stand at attention, eyes forward, respond only if directly addressed, maintain perfect military bearing at all times. This was exactly the kind of situation his years of training had prepared him for. As the princess approached, James could see that she was carrying something, a small package wrapped in what appeared to be official palace paper. She walked directly to his position and stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see her clearly without moving his eyes from their forward position. "Sergeant Morrison," she said with a warm smile that James could detect even in his peripheral vision, "I believe you know why I'm here." "Your Royal Highness," James replied, maintaining his position but acknowledging her presence with the appropriate military courtesy. I wanted to personally thank you for your actions several weeks ago, she continued. What you did for young Tommy exemplified the very best of what it means to serve. You showed that true duty isn't just about following rules, but about understanding the spirit behind those rules. James was deeply moved but remained at attention.
Thank you, Your Royal Highness. I was simply doing what felt right in the moment. Sometimes, the princess replied, that's exactly what duty requires. The Queen asked me to personally deliver this to you.
She extended the small package toward him. James realized he was facing an unprecedented situation. A member of the royal family was presenting him with what appeared to be an official recognition, but accepting it would require him to break position and, potentially, violate protocol once again. As if reading his thoughts, the princess smiled. You have permission to break position, Sergeant. In fact, you have a direct order from Her Majesty to do so. James carefully shifted his rifle and reached out to accept the package. His hands were steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. As he unwrapped the official paper, he discovered a beautiful wooden box with the royal crest embossed on the top. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a special commendation medal unlike anything he had seen before.
This is a new recognition, the princess explained.
Her Majesty has authorized the creation of the Royal Compassion Medal, to be awarded to members of the armed services who demonstrate exceptional humanity in the performance of their duties.
You are the first recipient. James stared at the medal in amazement.
It was beautifully crafted, with intricate details that spoke to the finest traditions of British military honors. But, more than its physical beauty, James was struck by what it represented: formal recognition that compassion and duty could work together rather than in opposition. The Queen wanted you to know, the princess continued, that your actions reminded everyone why military service matters.
It's not just about following orders or maintaining traditions. It's about protecting and serving the values that make civilization possible.
Kindness, courage, and human dignity are just as important as discipline and protocol. James felt overwhelmed by the honor, but also by the responsibility that came with it.
Your Royal Highness, I'm not sure I deserve such recognition. I simply did what any decent person would do.
That's exactly why you deserve it, she replied. You saw a situation where kindness was needed, and you provided it without thinking about personal consequences.
That's the definition of true service.
As James held the medal, he thought about Tommy and wondered how the little boy was doing. The last he had heard, the donations that had poured in after their encounter had ensured that Tommy was receiving the best possible treatment, and the early reports were encouraging. The brass button that James had given him had become a symbol of hope for the entire family.
There's something else, the princess said. Tommy and his family have been invited to a special reception at Buckingham Palace next week.
The Queen would like to meet him personally, and she has specifically requested that you be present as well.
James could hardly believe what he was hearing.
Not only was he not being punished for breaking protocol, but he was being honored for it and invited to meet the Queen alongside the brave little boy who had inspired his actions. It would be my honor, Your Royal Highness, James replied. As the princess prepared to leave, she paused and looked directly at James. You know, Sergeant, what you did that day has had effects far beyond what you might realize. We've received hundreds of letters from people around the world who were inspired by your example. Military personnel, teachers, healthcare workers, ordinary citizens, all saying that your story reminded them of the importance of putting humanity first.
James was moved by this revelation.
He had acted in a single moment of compassion, never imagining that it would resonate so broadly or inspire others to examine their own opportunities to show kindness. The Queen believes, the princess continued, that sometimes the most important service members of the armed forces can provide is to remind everyone else of our shared humanity.
You've done that in a very powerful way.
After the princess departed, James remained at his post, but his mind was racing with everything that had just happened. The medal in its wooden box seemed to carry enormous weight, not just as a physical object but as a symbol of everything he had learned about the relationship between duty and compassion. As the day progressed, James noticed that word of the princess's visit was spreading among the other guards and castle staff. Several of his colleagues approached during shift changes to congratulate him, and James was struck by how supportive everyone was being. Rather than seeing his actions as a dangerous precedent, his fellow service members seemed to view them as a reminder of why they had chosen military careers in the first place. That evening, as James prepared to leave the castle after his shift, he was approached by a young corporal who was relatively new to the Queen's Guard. "Sergeant Morrison," the young man said nervously, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. I've been struggling sometimes with the strictness of the protocols, wondering if we were losing sight of why we serve. What you did with that little boy reminded me that all the discipline and tradition exists to protect something important, our humanity." James was touched by the young corporal's words. "The rules matter," James replied carefully. "They exist for good reasons. But sometimes the most important rule is to remember why all the other rules exist in the first place." Over the following days, James began to receive letters from around the world. Parents of sick children, military veterans, teachers, healthcare workers, and ordinary citizens all writing to express how his story had affected them. Many shared their own stories of times when they had chosen compassion over convenience, kindness over protocol, human connection over institutional distance. One letter that particularly moved James came from a nurse in Australia who worked with terminally ill children. She wrote about how James's example had inspired her to spend a little extra time with each patient, to break some minor hospital rules when it meant bringing comfort to scared children and worried parents. She credited James with reminding her why she had become a nurse in the first place. Another letter came from a teacher in Canada who had started a classroom project where students looked for opportunities to show kindness even when it might be inconvenient or go against normal expectations. The students were calling it the James Morrison Challenge, though James himself felt embarrassed by the attention. As James read through these letters, he began to understand something profound about the nature of service and leadership. His simple act of kindness had somehow given other people permission to trust their own instincts about compassion and humanity. By breaking one rule in service of a higher principle, he had reminded countless others that the most important rules are often the unwritten ones about how we treat each other. The upcoming reception at Buckingham Palace loomed in James's mind as both an incredible honor and a tremendous responsibility. He would be representing not just himself, but everyone who believed that duty and compassion could work together. He would be standing alongside Tommy, whose courage continued to inspire him every day. But, more than anything, James was looking forward to seeing Tommy again. The little boy who had unknowingly challenged a Queen's Guard to remember what really mattered had become the center of an international conversation about kindness, service, and the importance of putting humanity first. James wanted to tell Tommy that his bravery had inspired not just one soldier to break protocol, but thousands of people around the world to examine their own opportunities for compassion. As James prepared for sleep that night, he held the Royal Compassion Medal in his hands one more time. It was beautiful, but what made it truly valuable was what it represented: formal recognition that the highest form of service is often the most human one. Tomorrow he would return to his post at Windsor Castle, where he would stand with the same discipline and precision he had always shown. But now he would also stand with the knowledge that sometimes the most important duty of all is simply being kind to someone who needs kindness. The medal would remind him every day that true service means protecting not just physical safety, but the values that make life worth protecting in the first place. And, at the center of those values, James now understood, was the simple recognition that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and compassion, especially when they're facing their darkest moments with courage beyond their years. Royal Guard Story, Part 5. The morning of the Buckingham Palace reception dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made London look like a painting. James Morrison stood in front of the mirror in his quarters, adjusting his dress uniform one final time. This wasn't his usual red tunic and bearskin hat, but the formal blue dress uniform reserved for the most important occasions. The Royal Compassion Medal had been properly mounted among his other service decorations, though it seemed to catch the light differently than the others, as if it carried its own special significance. James had barely slept the night before, not from nervousness but from anticipation. Today he would finally see Tommy again, and, more importantly, he would witness the little boy meet the Queen. In the weeks since their encounter at Windsor Castle, James had received regular updates about Tommy's condition through the network of support that had grown up around the family. The news had been consistently encouraging. The experimental treatment that the donated funds had made possible was showing remarkable results. The car that arrived to collect James was the same official vehicle that had brought the Princess of Wales to Windsor Castle. As they drove through the streets of London toward Buckingham Palace, James found himself reflecting on how much his understanding of service had evolved in just a few weeks. He had entered military service with a clear, simple understanding of duty: follow orders, maintain discipline, serve the crown with honor. But his encounter with Tommy had taught him that true service was more complex and more rewarding than he had ever imagined. The reception was being held in the Grand Hall of Buckingham Palace, a space James had never seen before despite his years of service. As he was escorted through the palace corridors, James was struck by the weight of history surrounding him. These walls had witnessed centuries of British history, moments of triumph and tragedy, decisions that had shaped the world. And, today, they would witness a celebration of something much simpler but equally important: the power of human kindness. As James entered the Grand Hall, the first person he saw was Tommy. The little boy was out of his wheelchair today, standing on his own 2 feet, though he still looked thin and fragile. But his eyes were bright with excitement, and he was wearing a new suit with the brass button from James's uniform proudly displayed on the lapel. When Tommy saw James across the room, his face lit up with pure joy. "James!" Tommy called out, using the first name with the easy familiarity of a child who had never learned that soldiers were supposed to be distant figures. He ran across the room as fast as his recovering body would allow, and James found himself breaking into a smile that felt as natural as breathing. James knelt down to Tommy's level, just as he had that first day at Windsor Castle. "Hello, Tommy," he said warmly. "You look wonderful. How are you feeling?" "So much better," Tommy replied excitedly. "The doctors say the medicine is working really well. Mummy says it's because so many people helped us after they saw the video of you giving me the button." Tommy's mother approached, and James could see immediately how much the stress had lifted from her face. She looked years younger than she had that first day at the castle, as if an enormous weight had been removed from her shoulders. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, taking his hand in both of hers, "I can never thank you enough. What you did that day changed everything for our family. Not just the donations and the medical care, but the hope. You gave us hope when we needed it most." Before James could respond, a hush fell over the room. The Queen had entered, accompanied by a small group of her personal staff. At 98 years old, she moved with careful dignity, but her presence filled the room with an authority that came from decades of service to her people. James immediately snapped to attention, his military training taking over despite the informal nature of the occasion. But the Queen gestured for him to relax, her expression warm and genuinely pleased. "Your Majesty," James said formally, "it is an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, Sergeant Morrison," the Queen replied, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had become famous around the world. "What you did at Windsor Castle reminded everyone why we value military service so highly. You showed that true strength includes the courage to be kind." Then, the Queen turned to Tommy, who was staring at her with wide-eyed amazement. James could see that the little boy was trying to remember the proper etiquette he had undoubtedly been taught for this occasion, but his natural enthusiasm was winning out. "And you must be Tommy," the Queen said, her voice becoming noticeably warmer. "I've heard so much about your courage. They tell me you've been very brave during your treatment." "Yes, ma'am." "Your Majesty," Tommy replied, stumbling slightly over the formal address but maintaining his composure admirably. "James taught me that being brave when you're scared is like following important rules." The Queen glanced at James with what appeared to be approval. "That's very wise advice. And I understand that James gave you something special to remember your visit to Windsor Castle." Tommy immediately pointed to the brass button on his jacket. "He gave me this from his real uniform. He said it was for my courage, but I think he's much braver than me." "I think," the Queen said thoughtfully, "that you're both brave in your own ways. James was brave enough to do what he knew was right, even when it meant breaking rules. And you've been brave enough to face something very difficult with grace and dignity." The Queen then did something that surprised everyone in the room. She reached into a small bag carried by one of her staff members and withdrew what appeared to be a children's book. But, as she handed it to Tommy, James could see that it wasn't just any book, it was a custom-made volume with Tommy's name embossed on the cover. "This is a special book about your adventure at Windsor Castle," the Queen explained. "It tells the story of a brave little boy who reminded a Queen's Guard about the most important part of his duty, taking care of people who need kindness." Tommy accepted the book with reverence, understanding that he was receiving something extraordinary. As he opened it, James could see that it was beautifully illustrated, showing the scene at Windsor Castle from multiple perspectives. There was Tommy in his wheelchair, looking up at James with wonder. There was James kneeling down to speak with him. And there was the final salute, captured in a drawing that somehow conveyed all the emotion of that original moment. "Will you read it to me sometime?" Tommy asked his mother, who was clearly fighting back tears. "Every night if you want," she replied. The reception continued for another hour, with the Queen speaking personally with Tommy's family and with James about the broader implications of what had happened at Windsor Castle. She explained that the story had reached her immediately through social media, but that it had also generated hundreds of letters from people around the world who had been inspired by the example of compassion overcoming protocol. "What you demonstrated," the Queen told James, "is that our finest traditions don't become outdated when they're challenged by human needs. They become more meaningful. The discipline and dedication of the Queen's Guard matter because they protect something precious, not just physical security, but the values that make our society worth protecting." As the formal part of the reception drew to a close, the Queen made an announcement that surprised everyone present. She declared that the Royal Compassion Medal that had been created for James would not be a one-time honor, but would become a permanent decoration available to members of the armed services who demonstrated exceptional humanity in their service. "Sometimes," the Queen said, "the most important military action is the decision to remember that we serve people, not just institutions. Sergeant Morrison has reminded us all of that truth." As the reception ended and guests began to depart, Tommy approached James one final time. The little boy was clutching his special book and seemed to want to say something but was struggling to find the words. "James," Tommy finally said, "when I grow up, can I be a Queen's Guard too?" James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "If that's what you want to do," he replied carefully, "then you should work very hard and follow your dreams. But remember, there are lots of ways to serve people and help them. The most important thing is to be kind and brave, just like you've already shown you can be." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if he was filing away this advice for future reference. Then, in a gesture that would stay with James for the rest of his life, Tommy snapped to attention and offered James the same small salute he had given that first day at Windsor Castle. This time, James didn't hesitate. He immediately returned the salute with full military precision, acknowledging not just Tommy's gesture but everything the brave little boy represented: the courage to face impossible challenges, the grace to inspire others even in difficult circumstances, and the wisdom to see the best in people even when they're just doing their jobs. As Tommy and his family departed, James found himself alone for a moment in the Grand Hall of Buckingham Palace. The weight of everything that had happened, from that first moment of decision at Windsor Castle to this incredible recognition from the Queen herself, seemed to settle over him like a warm blanket. James understood now that his life had been permanently changed by one moment of choosing compassion over protocol. But, more than that, he had learned that the most important service anyone can provide is to remind others of their own capacity for kindness. Tommy had done that for him, and somehow his response had done the same for thousands of other people around the world. The brass button that had started everything had become a symbol of something much larger: the idea that rules and compassion don't have to be enemies, that duty and humanity can work together, and that sometimes the most important tradition of all is the willingness to put people first when they need it most. As James left Buckingham Palace that afternoon and returned to his regular duties, he carried with him not just the honor of royal recognition, but the deeper satisfaction of knowing that his simple act of kindness had created ripples that were still spreading. Tommy was getting better, inspired by the support that had poured in from around the world. Other service members were finding ways to show compassion within their duties. And countless ordinary people were looking for their own opportunities to choose kindness over convenience. The next morning, James returned to his post at Windsor Castle. He wore the same red uniform, carried the same rifle, and maintained the same disciplined posture that had defined the Queen's Guard for centuries. But now he also carried something else: the knowledge that true service means protecting not just physical safety, but the human values that make life worth protecting in the first place. As visitors approached his post throughout the day, James stood with perfect military bearing. But he also stood with an open heart, ready to recognize when duty and compassion might call him to act with the same courage that a 7-year-old boy had shown him weeks earlier. He was still a Queen's Guard, bound by tradition and discipline. But he was also a reminder that the most important protocol of all is treating each other with the dignity and kindness that every human being deserves. And, somewhere in Scotland, a little boy was getting stronger every day, holding tight to a brass button that had become a symbol of hope, and reading a special book about the day a soldier remembered that the most important rule is simply being kind to someone who needs kindness.